We won't wait for anybody else. Good evening to all of you. Very warm welcome to our third evening of the Didsbury lectures. All those who are present here, all those who are online, very warm welcome. My name is Svetlana Komnia. I'm part of the NTC team, and we are very privileged to welcome Dr. Stephen Barton as our renowned speaker of the Didsbury lectures. Let me just remind you that Dr. Stephen Barton is a New Testament scholar with particular interest in the New Testament and theology, and he has published a number of various articles and books on various topics. And this time, during our Didsbury lectures period, he is presenting a very interesting theme on the emotions in early Christianity. So in the first lecture, he laid down theoretical and historical foundations to the theme. And in the subsequent lectures, he promised us to lead us through particular emotions. So some study cases on yesterday was a lecture on anger, and today the theme of today's lecture is grief, mourning, and consolation. Please join me in welcome Dr. Stephen Barton today as our speaker. So, very welcome.
Thank you, Svetlana, for that very warm welcome. And it's lovely to be with you again this evening. So my title for tonight is Grief, Mourning and Consolation, as the second in 3 case studies on early Christian emotions. Grief over the death of someone we love is natural and universal. The first stanza of W.H. Auden's poem Funeral Blues is eloquent in this regard. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos, and with muffled drum bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Note the accumulation of imperatives: stop, cut off, prevent, silence, bring out, let. They convey a rightful sense of crisis and disruption, demanding attention. They summon us to do what we know we should, lest death and grief overwhelm life. Having, in yesterday's lecture, considered anger within the emotional regime of early Christianity, I turn this evening to the often closely related emotion of grief. Although there are different types of grief in the New Testament, the case I have chosen is grief if I can turn the page. Grief as an expression of bereavement, along with its social manifestation in feeling rules, rituals of mourning, and practices of consolation. In short, I'm giving attention to how certain early Christ followers respond to, how they make sense of, the pain, loss, and disorientation caused by the death of one of their own. To this end, I'm taking a text from 1 Thessalonians, a letter now widely recognized as, either as a whole or in part, a work of consolation in response to its recipients' experiences of separation, suffering, loss, and grief. My question overall is, how were early Christian practices of grief, mourning, and consolation related to the believer's self-definition as people united by faith in a crucified, yet risen and returning heavenly Lord, heavenly Kurios. How did their eschatological hope distinguish the Christ followers, if at all, from their contemporaries? Because Paul's roots were nurtured in the Bible and the religion of Hellenized Second Temple Judaism, it's important to say something about grief, mourning, and consolation in Paul's inherited tradition. Given Israel's history of multiple traumas due to foreign domination and experiences of exile, relevant scriptural tradition is considerable in the prophets, Psalms, Lamentations, and the book of Job. So what follows is necessarily selective. As a way in, I begin with a warning about what used to be called the peril of modernizing. In his important monograph, A Time to Mourn, A Time to Dance, Gary Anderson makes a convincing case for interpreting grief and joy as behaviours first and foremost, behaviours given form and shape in ritual. Uncongenial as it may be for modern Westerners, indebted to cultural movements like Romanticism and existentialism, with their celebration of the internal life of the feeling individual, the primary focus in biblical and related texts is not on grief and joy as feelings, but on public obligation in a context of social relationships. Public obligation in a context of social relationships. An emotional component of grief and joy is not to be discounted, but, as another commentator puts it, what is done takes precedence over what is felt. With this observation in mind, Anderson makes the following points. First, texts pertaining to grief often occur in counterpoint with texts pertaining to joy. Grief and joy are integrally related. Indeed, mourning constitutes an interruption of the quotidian experience of life conceived as joy. And the cessation of mourning is marked by a return to joy. The import of this is that texts of grief and mourning ought not to be treated in isolation. Rather, they require interpretation within the emotional regime of Israelite life, law, and custom more broadly. Second, grief and joy in Israelite life are performative and public, as reflected in the odd Hebrew expression to do a grief or to do a joy. The same is true of concepts like love, hate, and honour, inextricably correlated as they are with behaving in certain ways. To love God is to keep God's commandments in fear and reverence. To hate one's wife is to take action to divorce her. To honour one's parents is to obey them and to look after them when they get old, and so on. As Anderson puts it, the movement is from behaviour to feeling, rather than the other way round. Third, as performative and public, to do a grief or to do a joy is to engage in what social anthropologists call a ritual process. The ritual makes possible a safe passage through the disintegration and isolation of grief and mourning to the reintegration and transformation of both individual and group, which are constitutive of life. This helps to explain why joyous behaviours often signal the end of behaviours associated with mourning. Indeed, joy and mourning are structural opposites. If mourning is ritualised in fasting, joy is ritualised in eating and drinking. If mourning is ritualised in sexual abstinence, joy finds sexual relations resumed. If for mourning there is lamentation, for joy there is cultic praise of God. If mourning finds ritual approximation to death in the act of putting ashes or dust on one's head, joy approximates to life in the practice of anointing with oil. If for mourning there is the tearing of one's clothes or the donning of sackcloth, for joy there is the putting on of festal garments. In short, mourning and joy follow an emotional script of ritualized behavior to the end that life, though inevitably reshaped, is sustained. Fourth, pertinent texts often occur in the context of a legal framework, including deliberations over what to do when ritual obligations conflict. The story of Judith is a case in point. In the wake of the death of her husband Manasseh, Judith is obliged to mourn. But the law also requires observance of Sabbaths and feast days. The narrative shows how she negotiated the conflict. In Judith 8, verses 4 to 6, Judith remained as a widow for 3 years and 4 months at home. She put sackcloth around her waist and dressed in widow's clothing. She fasted all the days of her widowhood, except the day before the Sabbath and the Sabbath itself, the day before the new moon and the day of the new moon, and the festivals and days of rejoicing of the house of Israel. The feast days, called days of rejoicing, overrode all the requirements of mourning. The fact that mourning and rejoicing presuppose the kind of legal framework evident here shows why mourning, like joy, can be prescribed. By extension, we may say that they are bound up with the exercise of authority, an authority often enhanced by the example set by people of power. As well as Hebrew Bible texts giving evidence of grief, mourning, and joy as ritual behaviours shaped by law and convention, there are also the ideas and images of a more philosophical kind, characteristic of writings within Hellenistic Judaism. A brilliant example, shaped by wisdom traditions, comes in Philo of Alexandria's Life of Abraham, the De Abrahamo. In his praise of Abraham as a true sophos, a true sage, Philo draws particular attention to his conduct at the death of his wife Sarah. And I quote, "When he had lost his lifelong partner, and when sorrow, lupe, was making itself ready to wrestle with his soul, he grappled with it as in the arena and prevailed. He gave strength and high courage to the natural antagonist of passion, reason, which he had taken as his counselor throughout his life, and now particularly was determined to obey. So excellent and profitable were its exhortations, were reason's exhortations. The advice was that he should not grieve over bitterly, as at an utterly new and unheard of misfortune, nor yet assume an indifference as though nothing painful had occurred, but choose the mean, to meson, rather than the extremes, and aim at moderation of feeling, not resent that nature should be paid the debt which is its due, but quietly and gently lighten the blow." The testimonies for this show that after weeping for a little over the corpse, he quickly rose up from it, holding further mourning, it appears, to be out of keeping with wisdom, which taught that death is not the extinction of the soul, but its separation and detachment from the body, and its return to the place whence it came. And it came, as was shown in the story of creation, from God. End of quote. From Philo's account, it is as if Sarah's loss is a test, an arena for combat between emotion and reason, in which reason emerges victorious. The extremes of uncontrolled grief on the one hand, or indifference on the other, are avoided in favour of the mean, of moderation of feeling. Nature is not resented but allowed its due, and customary mourning rituals like weeping are disciplined. Perhaps above all, Abraham's behaviour is consistent with his belief that death is not the extinction of the soul, but its separation and detachment from the body and its return to the place whence it came, that is, from God. Not coincidentally, Abraham's behaviour is epiphanic. The chief men who come to offer consolation are, quote, profoundly amazed. The absence of customary mourning ritual, the wailing, dirges, and breastbeating, and the constraint practiced by Abraham's household evokes a remarkable choral confession. Thou art a king from God among us. In sum, Abraham's mourning is that of a model wise man. His behaviour instantiates his central beliefs about the nature and destiny of the self and what it means to be alive. It also marks him out as a person of distinction. From the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism, we move to conventions about grief in the emotional regimes of the wider Greco-Roman world. For present purposes, I note the following main features. First, grief and mourning were a matter of social comment, philosophical debate, and therapeutic practice. This found expression in a rich tradition of rhetorical manuals, philosophical treatises, consolatory discourses, funerary orations, rituals of lamentation, death scenes in drama and literature, non-literary testimony in the form of funerary inscriptions, letters on papyri, and visual representations of the deceased in sculpture and portraiture. In elite circles, accounts of exemplary deaths offered models for inspiration and imitation. Plato's account in the Phaedo of the death of Socrates is one of the most famous. At a later time, Cicero found inspiration in the death of Cato. Worth mentioning in respect of therapeutic practice are what Abraham Smith calls consolation visits, paid by philosophers in their socially approved role as moral physicians. Smith quotes Dio Chrysostom as follows: "And if it is a man's misfortune to lose any one of his relatives, either his wife or a child or a brother, he asks the philosopher to come and speak words of comfort, as if he thought it were only then necessary to consider the future." That the presence of the philosopher as a moral physician with the grieving is regarded as a potential source of comfort is significant. Not only does it remind us of the social nature of grief, mourning, and consolation, it also speaks of the felt value of the role of an authority figure in helping those in grief to interpret their experience, to find reason even in the midst of the unfathomable. Generally speaking, for the ideal wise man, death is not an evil. Instead, it is a test of character. Particularly interesting for the hints it reveals about a range of views regarding the propriety of grief is Seneca's advice in his Consolation to Polybius, his work Consolation to Polybius. Never will I demand of you that you not grieve at all. I know that there are to be found certain men whose wisdom is more harsh than courageous, who deny that a wise man should mourn. I don't believe that these men have ever experienced such a misfortune, for otherwise fortune would have knocked such arrogant wisdom out of them and forced them all unwilling to confess the truth. Reason will manifest itself sufficiently if one simply eliminates from one's grief what is excessive and disproportionate. No one should hope or desire to feel that it is wholly non-existent. Let the tears flow, but let them also cease. Let the groans be drawn from one's deepest bosom, but let them also come to an end. Plainly, at one end of the spectrum, the ideal man of reason is the one who exercises maximum self-control according to the feeling rule that a wise man, the practitioner of apatheia or detachment, should not mourn. At the other end of the spectrum is the folly of grief that is disproportionate, presumably because it invites the shame that attaches to lack of dignity and self-control. What Seneca advocates is something in between, a wisdom that is less arrogant, that accepts that grief is natural in human experience, but keeps it within reasonable limits that serve to protect personal equanimity, social obligation, and social standing. Second, in the comment and debate, popular arguments intended to serve as a therapy for grief took various forms, combining rational persuasion with practical exhortation. Paul Holloway summarizes as follows. He says, popular arguments specific to death included that grief does not benefit the dead, that the dead do not want us to grieve, that life is a gift from God to be relinquished without complaint, that surviving friends and loved ones can serve as replacements for the dead, that death is gain, and related to this, that an early death preempts future suffering and temptation. Other common arguments were that time heals all grief, that grief is unhealthy, that grief accomplishes nothing, that others have suffered similar things, and that suffering improves the sufferer and can therefore be viewed as a gift of God. End of that list. Taking one or two of those by way of example, on the healing that the passage of time makes possible, listen, for example, to Pliny the Younger in his letter to Aephilanus Marcellinus regarding the tragic death of the 13-year-old daughter of their mutual friend Fundanus. He says, if then you write anything to him, to Fundanus, in his very natural sorrow, be careful not to offer any crude form of consolation which might suggest reproof. Be gentle and sympathetic. Passage of time will make him readier to accept this. A raw wound shrinks from a healing hand, but later permits and even seeks help. And so the mind rejects and repels any consolation in its first pangs of grief, but feels the need of comfort and is calmed if this is kindly offered. On the argument that excessive grief is contrary to nature, here is Pliny again, reporting on what he regards as the shameful excess displayed by his fellow senator Marcus Aquilius Regulus on the death of Regulus's son. This is what Pliny writes. Regulus has lost his son, the one evil he did not deserve. You meant to chuckle at that point. It's very acerbic, this. Now that his son is dead, he mourns with wild extravagance. The boy used to possess a number of Gallic ponies for riding and driving, also dogs of all sizes, and nightingales, parrots and blackbirds. Regulus had them all slaughtered around his pyre. This was not grief, but parade of grief. He mourns as nobody ever did. He decided to commission as many statues and portraits as he possibly could. So he sets all the workshops busy, portraying him in colour, in wax, bronze, silver, gold, ivory and marble. He even collected a vast audience the other day to hear him read a memoir of his son, the life of a mere boy. For Pliny, whereas a Roman male of high rank and status should exemplify the core values of dignity, self-control and moderation, which would permit the management of death without threat to the Roman order, Regulus's extravagant behaviour over the loss of a mere boy is transgressive. Tellingly, it is not grief, but parade of grief. As a final example, the argument that knowledge of the fate of the dead offers consolation takes two basic forms. According to Epicurus, the fear of death is dispelled by the knowledge of post-mortem extinction. Quote, so death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us, but when death comes, we do not exist. End of quote. Alternatively, the fear of death is assuaged by the knowledge of the beatitude of the departed in a life of immortality. Thus, Socrates consoles his friends in anticipation of his death, as told in Plato's Apology, by imagining the prospect of eternity in the company of all the men and women of renown who have preceded him. I quote, what would one not give, gentlemen, to be able to question the leader of that great host against Troy, or to question Odysseus or Sisyphus or the thousands of other men and women whom one could mention, to talk and mix and argue with whom would be unimaginable happiness. Of course, such consolatory arguments are conventional in many respects, shaped also by rhetorical and therapeutic concerns. But it is hard not to believe that in the individual and social navigation of death, they offered reasons to go on. Especially noteworthy, and this is my third main point, is the fact that practices of grief, mourning and consolation were implicated in the formation and maintenance of social identity. Lines were drawn in various ways. One was broadly anthropological, with lines distinguishing categories of humanity in rhetorically stark threesomes. Thus, according to Seneca, quote, despite suffering the same bereavement, women are wounded more deeply than men, barbarians more than the civilized, and the uneducated more than the learned. End of quote. Clearer articulations of hierarchies of value and power in assumptions about grief and mourning could hardly be found. The binary distinctions of gender, race, and status according to which value is calibrated and society is organised, are perpetuated and defended, even intensified. Death and associated behaviours are conservative. They are not allowed to disrupt the status quo. But as well as broad anthropological distinctions, conventions around grief and mourning also distinguish philosophies and worldviews. This is evident in Cicero's summary statement in Tusculan Disputations 376, and I quote, and he's referring to different philosophical schools here under particular people's names. These then are the duties of consolers: to uproot grief completely, or to calm it, or to remove it as much as possible, or to restrain it and not allow it to spread further, or to divert it elsewhere. Some, such as Cleanthes, think that the only duty of the consoler is to teach that it is not an evil at all. Others, like the Peripatetics, that it is not a great evil. There are some who redirect attention from evils to goods, as Epicurus does. There are others, such as the Cyrenaics, who think that it is sufficient to show that nothing unexpected has happened. And Chrysippus thinks that the chief element in consoling is to relieve the mourner of the opinion that he should be mourning, in case he thinks that he is performing a just and obligatory duty. If we ask why consolatory advice functions to distinguish one philosophical school from another, the answer is to be found in their respective theories of the passions or emotions and the ontologies of which those theories are an expression. Death words and death rites highlight such differences in particularly acute ways. Fourth, indicative of the destabilising potential of the phenomena, grief and mourning were subject to sanction and control. One aspect of this concerns rules to do with the duration of the period of mourning. For example, a late 2nd century legal text has this: parents and children over 6 years of age can be mourned for a year, children under 6 for a month. A husband can be mourned for 10 months, close blood relatives for 8 months. Anyone who acts contrary to the restrictions is placed in public disgrace. Anyone in mourning ought to refrain from dinner parties, jewellery and other adornments, and purple and white clothing. Here, a threat of public sanction is imposed on mourning deemed excessive, where propriety and therefore moral and social value are calibrated according to the age and gender of the deceased and the affinal or consanguinal proximity of the dead to the living. The status of the deceased is a factor also. That infants have relatively little status value is indicated by the fact that they are accorded the shortest period of mourning. That the regime includes restraint in respect of conviviality, adornments and attire is indicative of what David Constant calls an understanding of grief as a social function, not merely a private sentiment. Grief, understood as mourning, has a ritualised aspect and hence falls under the jurisdiction of public authority and custom. Fifth, as has become apparent already, there is a clear gender dimension to these mourning rules. As Valerie Hope puts it, death was women's work, but men still sought to control it. Have we met that before? This is how Seneca begins his letter on consolation to the bereaved, to Marullus for his excessive grief at the death of his infant son. Is it solace you are looking for? Let me give you a scolding instead. You are like a woman in the way you take your son's death. What would you do if you had lost an intimate friend? As well as the gendered derogatory analogy, you are like a woman, one notes here also the valorization of the death of a close friend over the death of an infant son. Sixth, and finally, attention should be drawn to an aspect of philosophical consolation in particular, namely that it offers a hermeneutic. In their role as moral physicians, the philosophers offer a diagnosis and a therapy. The therapy has two main aspects. First, a way of seeing, according to which grief and loss are interpreted or reinterpreted in accord with reason. Second, the encouragement of personal agency with a view to growth in resilience. By such therapy, the wounds of grief can begin to heal and mourning can give way to joy. We will see that this hermeneutical aspect is crucial in the development of a distinctively Christian understanding and practice of death. In sum, grief and its social manifestation in mourning were matters of wide concern in the Greco-Roman world. This concern manifested itself in feeling rules, whose aim was to set limits on grief and manage thereby a safe passage from death to life, chaos to order, and separation to reintegration. In philosophical circles, grief and mourning were topoi dealt with according to larger preconceptions about ontology, teleology, and virtue. That is, preconceptions about the embodied self and how to attain happiness in a life of virtue lived according to nature. Given the plurality of philosophical and societal views, a distinctive stance on grief and mourning was a likely indication of a group's beliefs, identity, and moral ethos. Which brings us to the case of early Christianity. With this observation about beliefs and practices to do with grief as indicators of group identity and moral ethos, we turn to our case study from early Christianity. Against the literary and historical background I have sketched just now, how may early Christian grief be interpreted? Does the emotional regime of the first Christians conform to those of the wider society or depart from them? May we speak of the first Christ followers as witnesses to, participants in, a conversion of the emotions when it comes to the matter of grief. A key passage, which is the earliest extant Christian text to give direct attention to the topos of grief in the face of death, is 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:11, itself consisting of two subunits, 4:13 to 18 and 5:1 to 11. The first subunit, 4:13 to 18, is concerned to dispel grief over the fate of those who have died. The second, 5:1 to 11, is concerned to give instruction and encouragement to the living. These two subunits are integrally related. As well as the overlapping eschatological subject matter and apocalyptic imagery, both parts climax with an imperative which binds them together around the theme of consolation. Parakalete allelus, encourage one another. I quote, But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus God will bring with him those who have died. Therefore encourage one another with these words. And then in the second subunit, for God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, as indeed you are doing. Regarding context, the death of members of the presumably small association of Christ followers in Thessalonica will have been seriously destabilizing, as converts who had turned from their traditional native religion, gods and worldview, and in consequence were the victims of social ostracism, harassment and persecution from kinsfolk and compatriots. The Thessalonian believers were vulnerable already. Now this sense of vulnerability will have been aggravated by further pain, this time due to the deaths of fellow Christ followers. A crisis they were apparently not expecting due to their conviction that the parousia, the return of their risen Lord, was imminent. Coping with untimely deaths is one thing, but implicit questions cried out for an answer. What would be the fate of those brothers and sisters who had died? Would they share with the still living in the glory of which Christ's resurrection and promised return was the guarantee? Or were they lost? So not only did the deaths represent a tear in the fabric of the believers' now more circumscribed communal ties, they also represented a tear in the fabric of their intensely eschatological faith. And if of their faith, then of their self-understanding, moral life, and sense of future destiny. So Paul's advice on grief is expressive of wider social and soteriological concerns. Whatever the precise circumstances of death that prompted Paul's words, it is clear that he is doing what any father figure or philosophical psychagogue would do when a death in the household or community occurs. He is offering consolation. The consolation takes the form of a letter which consoles, in part by making the absent Paul present literarily, the letter taking the place of the apostle himself. As is common in traditions of consolation, Paul's letter contains not only expressions of sympathy, but also exhortation with a view to shaping the recipient's emotions and instructing them on how to live. Strikingly, however, where it was customary in the wider culture to seek to control grief within reasonable bounds by limiting its duration and curating its ritual performance, Paul appears to be ruling out grief altogether. Or perhaps, given the lapse of time between Paul's apparently enforced departure from Thessalonica and his writing the letter, it may be the case that the discipline Paul has in mind is directed towards the cessation of a practice of mourning that is already underway. Whether this is indeed the case, or whether Paul is engaged primarily in reinforcing the boundary between believers and unbelievers by drawing a symbolic line between the way Christ followers should grieve and the grieving of hoi lopoi, the rest, is disputed. Certainly, Paul's statement of the goal he has in view, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope, is open to more than one interpretation. What is hardly open to doubt, however, is that the advice Paul offers places him at or near one end of the spectrum of the debate in philosophical and other circles of his day as to whether grief and its social manifestation in mourning were rational responses to death for those who regarded themselves as truly wise and virtuous. In all likelihood, the consolation Paul offers has moral and rhetorical weight among the implied recipients, at least in part because it is comparable with the therapeutic teaching of the Stoics and others, with their emphasis on the strict control of the passions on the basis of right judgment. However, in the case of Paul, what is especially noteworthy is not just the rigour of the feeling rule on grief, but its rationale. Whereas the appeal of the philosophers was to the attainment of happiness in this life, however short or long, through the practice of reason, the consolation Paul offers is based on reason and emotion transformed by revelation. Wisdom, we might say, is being reshaped by apocalyptic, a hidden kind of wisdom newly disclosed. Drawing on eschatological motifs from the streams of his native Jewish tradition, especially the apocalyptic stream, but now significantly recast and historicised in terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus, Paul engages in a conversion of the emotions of the Thessalonian bereaved. It is as if the conversion of life that had begun with their transfer of allegiance to the service of the living and true God has to be taken further to the conversion of their emotions, not least emotions associated with life in the face of death. To bring this about, what Paul does is to reconstruct the event that gave rise to the emotion, to reconstruct the event that gave rise to the emotion. As a kind of moral physician offering consolation, he offers a different way of seeing things, what the Stoics would think of as a rational corrective to false judgment. In a nutshell, Paul offers a new narrative, an apocalyptic narrative, according to which those who have died are reincorporated with the living in a great eschatological drama inaugurated by the death and resurrection of Christ in time past, soon to reach its climax with his parousia in time future. To render the narrative persuasive as consolation, Paul shapes things as follows. First, he reduces the gulf separating the dead from the living. Those who have died are only asleep, a euphemism repeated 3 times. To this we may add the remarkable indifference Paul displays over whether at the parousia the believer is awake or asleep. What matters is not whether we are awake or asleep, but that the destiny of both the living and the dead is the same, which is life with Christ. Second, and related, there is the pervasive rhetoric of union. Hence the fourfold occurrence of with language. God will bring with him those who have died. 4:14. Then we who are alive will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. 4:17. And so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. 5:10. Powerful here is the language of divine presence, of heavenly solidarity, of not being abandoned, even in death. Third, invoking the authority of revelation, a scenario of end-time events is set down with a view to offering reassurance. The salvific agents involved are divine: God, Jesus the risen Lord, and the archangel are the active players. The sequence of events is laid out as preordained, making abundantly clear that anxieties about the fate of those who have died are baseless. The dead will be raised, followed by the rapture of the living, together with whom they will meet the Lord in the air. The value of persons, especially in the honour of precedence accorded the deceased, is affirmed, since the dead in Christ will rise first. The scope of action is neither insignificant nor parochial, but cosmic. The Lord descends from heaven. Believers are caught up in the clouds, and they meet the Lord in the air. And the soundscape Paul evokes is that of decisive martial action, including the Lord's cry of command, the archangel's call, and the sound of God's trumpet. Fourth, there is the pervasive language of distinction. The consolation Paul offers works to honour the Thessalonian believers by marking them out. Whereas believers are enlisted as privileged participants in a glorious narrative that projects them both upward towards heaven and forward into the future in the company of the risen Lord, their unbelieving neighbours are characterised in decidedly pessimistic terms as the rest who have no hope. Yet further, in another binary categorisation, over against the others who are of the night or of the darkness, who fall asleep and get drunk, believers are children of light and children of the day, awake and sober. In sum, the consolation of believers comes in terms of the ascription to them of a distinctive, honourable, eschatological identity and destiny. Finally, the consolation Paul offers includes exhortation about how to sustain community in the face of death. Hence the oikodomeo language at the climax of the second subunit. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, as indeed you are doing. 2 illustrations will suffice. Perhaps what is most important in this work of upbuilding is signalled in the call to arms. Since we belong to the day, let us be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. The arms, notably, are defensive, a breastplate and a helmet. The breastplate consists of faith and love, the helmet, hope. Here we have the famous trio of virtues, but whereas the conventional sequence is faith, hope, love, as we know from 1 Corinthians 13, here the climactic final position is given to hope. Paul has used the same sequence just once before in the letter's opening thanksgiving, where he speaks of remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labour of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ, chapter 1, verse 3. So from a literary point of view, what we have here is an inclusio. These 3 virtues, with hope given preeminence, bind the intervening material together. We can see why hope is given preeminence. In terms of the eschatological soteriology which underpins Paul's gospel, there is no virtue more critical for offering consolation to a grieving community than steadfastness in resurrection hope. But important also in this work of upbuilding is what encourages belonging. Noteworthy here are the kinship metaphors, used with a view to binding the believers together as a fictive family, where nurture is given and received, proper authority is recognised, and mutual responsibility practised. So Paul speaks of caring for each family member gently, like a nurse, tenderly caring for her own children. At the same time, he is the believer's father, and they are his children, to whom he relates individually, encouraging them in the way of holiness. Also, as Paul's children, they are necessarily brothers and sisters of one another, with the mutual responsibilities that siblingship involves. Reinforcing the family imagery is the rare paranesis on brotherly love, Philadelphia, which is reinforced through the exhortation to love one another. Related also are rituals of mutual recognition, such as that which Paul commands at the end of the letter. Greet all the brothers and sisters with a holy kiss. In sum, the fostering of ideals and practices of fictive kinship is consistent with building and sustaining community, an end-time community bound together by strong affective ties and energized by eschatological hope. Conclusion. What I have offered this evening is a modest attempt to bring interdisciplinary analysis to bear on a tiny fragment of evidence about the Christian construction of one particular emotion, the emotion of grief, as addressed by Paul in his earliest letter. What Paul offers as a therapy for grief in the face of death is an emotion rule of restraint, even resistance, shaped by the consoling reassurance of a distinctively Christian hope and sustained by participation in a family-like community of the holy. The personal and social bonds that have been stretched to breaking point by death are renewed both by means of an eschatological narrative reshaping reality and by social practices and disciplines oriented on solidarity. Their intended effect is to reincorporate the dead with the living, to reincorporate the dead with the living in a cosmic Christological drama that embraces time, space, and persons under the sovereign protection of the one identified in the final benediction as the God of peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for another very rich lecture, Dr. Barton. I'm sure you have some questions today. Please think carefully what you want to ask. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. Be brave. Come and ask this question, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from people online. And I think, Samuel, you're working with that. Whenever the questions come, please post them in the comments in whatever venue you are listening to these lectures. Anyway, I'll give you a few moments to think about questions. What a journey. Grief, bereavement, consolation, and lots of things from First Thessalonians, Paul's letter. Yes, thank you, Robert.
This isn't entirely well formulated, but it's something that's sort of come up each evening. You've talked about emotions as a form of judgment, of cognition, and I'm wondering, how far is it a matter of taking the data of the world and forming a judgment about them, and how far is it a matter of seeing the world in the light of the emotion, so that the world is revealed under grief, revealed under anger, etc.
I think that latter is a very helpful way of putting it, that I suppose it's getting towards the idea of a kind of emotional intelligence in a way, isn't it? That as one's emotions are shaped in community and socialization and importantly in social relationships, one is able to, that the emotions become a source of a kind of wisdom about how the world is and how to respond to it. Yeah, I think that's right. So that's why I think the development in understanding emotions as a form of cognition is quite significant. It raises the profile of the emotions in a way, and it helps to overcome this damaging polarization of emotion and rationality, which is in popular parlance very pervasive. Some people celebrate the priority of emotions over rationality. Other people decry that development. And so to have an understanding which actually binds the two together in a much more positive way, much more holistic way, as giving us a way of navigating the world. I found that very helpful. I think that's implicit in what you were saying. Yeah, thank you.
Are you satisfied, Robert? Thank you very much. Any other questions today? Please, Kent.
Thank you so much for that brilliant exposition of 1 Thessalonians. I really loved it and learned from it, and I wish I'd have known about it when I wrote something on this years ago. But there we are. What strikes me as I listen to you today is, to what extent are our practices in grief, funeral practices in the Christian church modeled more upon a Greco-Roman background than they are on Paul's kind of rethinking here? Sometimes when I've been at funerals, I could have simply thought I was listening to one of your philosophers rather than Paul. Is there any comment you might make on that? Is there anything to think about?
So you're taking us out of the realm of New Testament interpretation and the world of antiquity into into pastoral theology in a way, and the practice of funerals, especially Christian funerals. Yeah, that's right, and that's very important. I think the secularization of society has lent itself to the appropriation of those Greco-Roman philosophical assumptions and ideas. I'm sure that's right. Of course, these days, funerary rites of passage are so many and various, aren't they? And people use them to say as much about themselves, about the living, as about the dead. So it's very easy then for the distinctively Christian hope to be completely submerged, isn't it? Yes, that's right. And things become reduced to a very private and personal kind of practice, rather than one which tries to embrace what life might truly mean and what death in life might truly mean, for which the Christian gospel has important things to say, not least in relation to it being a gospel of hope. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I wish my friend Douglas Davies from Durham in the Department of Theology were here. He is the British expert on death and runs an MA in death studies and has written numerous books on death and dying and so on, including as a Christian theologian. So I'm out of my depth at this point, but yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, please. Can you come to the microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Just what you said on funerals, if you went to an Irish funeral, there's a lot of celebration as well as grief. And my experience of life as a deepening in the spiritual life is that emotions can coexist that would, in ordinary parlance, be opposites. And earlier on, when you were talking about the background, you said that to do a grief or to do a joy reminded me of Paul saying, put on the new man, put on. And I was wondering if you have any insight or if you've seen other things in your studies in the New Testament that talk about different emotions in a more balanced person, different emotions being able to coexist and it not being as polarised as we tend to think.
Yeah, that's great. Funerals, and especially mourning as the kind of public practice of death and dying, the bringing of death into society by certain ritual practices, that can include joy and celebration, that grief can go along with joy and celebration. I'm sure actually is this relates to Kent's question in a way, doesn't it? Because it makes vivid and felt the Christian doctrine that in the resurrection of Christ, death has been defeated in some ultimate sense. And of course, in the Orthodox, capital O, Orthodox tradition, death is a birth into eschatological existence, isn't it? So it's a ground for celebration in that sense as well. But that also relates to what I was saying about the Old Testament, the way in which mourning and joy are kind of bound up with each other, and they're not separate. They're integrally related. So yeah, I'm sure that's right. And as we'll see tomorrow when I'm talking about joy, Paul in Philippians can talk about joy in the face of death. So there's kind of anticipatory grief there, but also eschatological joy in arising out of his faith in the risen Christ. And then your other point. Oh yes, yes. That's right. Yes, yes. Yes, and that's right. That relates to this point that Gary Anderson makes, that that behaviour, in some sense, can precede feeling, and behaviour shapes feeling. Our tendency is to focus on the feelings, almost sometimes to the neglect of the doing. Sometimes, I suppose, because we're overwhelmed by the feelings. And so the doing provides a kind of framework, doesn't it? It involves intentionality, it involves agency, it involves community, and all of those things allow grief to be taken up into into life, really, yeah. I mean, I think salvation is about life, isn't it? And so we have to see even death within a larger context of what makes for life. And I think that's at the heart of the Christian gospel.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hello again. Please excuse me taking you completely off beam in some ways. You'll be aware of the personality schema called the Enneagram.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if you've formed a picture, particularly when studying Paul as the harbinger of early Christianity, as to where he sits in Enneagrammatic terminology. In other words, is he basically motivated by his heart, his emotional, or his gut, or his head? Does he like emotions? Is he emotional, or is he actually not? What do you think about him as a personality as a result of your work?
I think Paul is a deeply feeling person. His experience, his faith is grounded in the experience of an apocalypse. He talks about Christ being revealed to him. And so this is a profoundly life-changing, revelatory, ecstatic experience which manifests itself in bodily repercussions as well. And his letters are very passionate, aren't they? Because he's writing, he sees himself as a father who has brought these children, these people, like a parent bringing them into existence. So the bonds of love are extremely strong, and that's why he's so hurt when they go astray, and so he writes sometimes to bring them back, to correct them, which is what a father will do. So I think his theology is profoundly experiential. Yeah.
Thank you.
He talks about his thorn in the flesh, doesn't he? So that's something that he laments. That he has this, and he's prayed 3 times that would be taken from him. But then he said, but your grace is sufficient. So there's a kind of vulnerability there, isn't there? Which I think which is a kind of strength in a way. In fact, he talks about strength in weakness, doesn't he? Over against those who boast in their accomplishments and their pedigree and all of that kind of thing. You know, it's as if he becomes transparent to Christ or the Spirit of Christ. And he wants that to be the case for his children as well. Does that make any sense? Yeah. I don't know where it fits on the Enneagram scheme of things, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. We have lots of questions, I hope. Any others? While you are thinking, I have maybe a speculative question, but here we are. I'm interested in the way you said about gender dimensions to grief rules in the ancient antiquity, especially. I just wonder about Paul. I read Paul in inclusive terms, and I have my own reading and lenses on that, and I can say, but I wonder whether Paul can be read differently in terms of these gender rules as well. Particularly, does he address the moderate or grieving in 1 Thessalonians as an inclusive issue? Or elsewhere he says, obviously, about silencing of women in the church services. Does it mean that they have or they can be more vocal elsewhere, meaning mourning in the public while being silent in the church services?
Well, it's certainly interesting in 1 Thessalonians that there's no mention of a gender divide, is there?
Yeah.
He just addresses them all as adelphoi, which we have to translate brothers and sisters, even though it's a masculine noun. But yes, I think he has such a strong sense of an alternative narrative of what's involved here when death strikes, as it were. And it's that alternative narrative based on the death and resurrection of Christ and the soon coming of the risen Lord, that these other things pale into insignificance, you know. He doesn't have to try and score points like the philosophers do in certain respects. I'm trying to think if there are places where Paul says, you know, something like, you're behaving like a woman. As we saw in the case of one of the, I think it was Cicero, which is a kind of, you know, put down. And I can't think of any, yeah. But it is clear in the Corinthian context that he is concerned about, well, it's something we were talking about yesterday as well, threats to the order of the public gathering, where if gender roles are, as it were, completely overthrown, then this can bring shame on the Christian gathering from outsiders and so on and so forth. So he remains sensitive to that issue. But I think in a kind of eschatological context, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male and female. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have a question from online.
I'm just the messenger, of course. And I hope I'm slow to anger, but also slow to understanding sometimes. So I'll ask the question, and I'm sure you can make more of it than I can. Steve Wright is asking, is this a rethinking of grief, so what you've offered, is that a rethinking of grief, or a view that Christian death is not an occasion of grief in the ordinary sense? Death, after all, is not the only cause of grief.
Certainly death is definitely not the only cause of grief. And that's why I specified that I was talking about grief in relation to bereavement. That's been my sole focus in this paper. So, sorry, is the question whether grief...
Just repeat it again.
Whether what you offer is a rethinking of grief itself,
Right,
or a view that Christian death is actually not an occasion for grief.
right. Well, this relates to a discussion, a scholarly discussion, around what Paul actually means when he says that you may not grieve like the others who have no hope. Does he mean you ought not to grieve at all? Which is a line that John Barclay has argued, a previous Didsbury lecture. Or, as I think myself, it's not that you shouldn't grieve at all, but that you shouldn't grieve like the others. And what does that mean for Paul? It means seeing this event within a larger event of creation, salvation, the hope of heaven. So it's grieving understood and practiced differently. In a way which then becomes a kind of witness. Yeah.
Thank you. If you have any final questions, I know it's our third evening already, and we are tired, but tomorrow we'll come with the fresh ideas and thoughts, right? So last chance to ask a question on grief and bereavement today. Well, thank you very much. That was an absolutely wonderful lecture, Dr. Barton. I enjoyed it. I've made so many notes, and I think on the practical level, there are so many things to think about, as we talked about the retrospective, even thinking, even in the case of Christ event, and retelling the story that brings already joy. And then you look at the bereavement and death, I think, from a different perspective as part of the eschatological framework. And then so many other things that we've talked about. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Let us thank the speaker today for this wonderful lecture. So please don't forget, we have another lecture tomorrow, and this one is on the emotion of
Joy.
Joy, of
Joy
course.
and rejoicing.
Yes, and that's where you have to come. So it's the other end, the other spectrum of grief. So please come at 7:30 tomorrow. Good night. Enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.